turned my blazer twice that morning. Not because I cared about cameras, but because I believed 11 years of my life were about to be recognized. The banner behind the stage read, Nobel-level breakthrough in neuroregenerative medicine. My model, my 18,000 patient records, my 70-hour weeks and salvaged grants. I stood in the second row, hands cold, quietly rehearsing a thank you I thought I had earned. But deep within that fragile excitement, something unsettling crept into my chest that I couldn't explain. Where are you listening to my story? Your city must be beautiful. Right. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to share with me the moments that will unfold next. And on the stage at that moment, Dean Daniel Whitmore stepped up with a half smile. He didn't look at me. He adjusted the microphone and smiled at the cameras. This breakthrough represents the future of neuroregenerative medicine, led by my daughter, Dr. Elise Whitmore. Applause detonated across the room. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. My name never came. Elise stood up, glowing under the lights. 3 months ago, she asked me the difference between regression and correlation. Last week, she forwarded me a spreadsheet with the formula cells deleted because she didn't want to break anything. Whitmore finally glanced in my direction. Not apologetic, not uncertain, just a calm, paternal look that said, "You understand how this works." Yes, I did. And I also knew something no one else in that room did. There was a deviation buried in the normalization coefficient 0.7%. Small enough to hide in celebration, large enough to collapse replication under scrutiny. I had found it weeks ago, and I left it there. My phone vibrated in my palm. Subject line request for original raw data submission, Swedish Medical Prize Committee. I have a small note like this. This story is fictional, shaped by real professional tensions and ethical conflicts, with certain elements enhanced by artificial intelligence for depth and clarity, while the events are imagined. The emotions and power struggles reflect realities many people experience. I hope it resonates with you. The erasure began the morning after the applause faded. Whitmore summoned me to his office, closed the door, and folded his hands like a benevolent king. Taryn, you're brilliant, but leadership matters. Elise represents legacy. Legacy. I had lived in that lab 70 hours a week. When our federal grant was cut, I wired $320,000 of my own savings to keep the trials alive. I declined offers from Stanford and MIT because finishing the experiment mattered more than prestige. He nodded as if I were a loyal employee being gently reassigned. Within 24 hours, my server access was revoked. My name disappeared from 6 published papers. My lab badge stopped working. Facilities escorted me out like a visiting vendor who had overstayed. Meanwhile, Elise sent an internal email, excited to continue my father's visionary work. Visionary. The man once confused neural scaffolds with protein mesh during a donor dinner. Now he was the architect of a revolution. I didn't protest. I didn't send angry emails. I didn't call a lawyer. Humiliation is loud on the inside. But I kept my face neutral, because before my access was cut, I had archived the entire raw dataset offline, every timestamp, every version history, including the flawed normalization coefficient they never noticed. Late that afternoon, an external biotech investor emailed the department, congratulating Elise and requesting independent verification of the original data. Control returned to me the moment I reviewed the model alone. The deviation was small 0.7% buried inside the enzyme concentration normalization step. In the published model, that shift inflated neural regeneration projections to 82%. On paper, it looked historic. In reality, when recalculated without distortion, the recovery rate stabilized at 61%. Respectable, publishable, but not Nobel level, not miraculous. If Phase 3 clinical trials moved forward, no patients would die. The compound wasn't toxic, the mechanism wasn't dangerous, but the outcome would collapse under replication. Hospitals would report inconsistent results, Investors would question efficacy. The miracle would quietly deflate into mediocrity. That was the silent variable. I had discovered it weeks earlier during a late-night recalibration. I corrected it in my private archive. I did not correct it in theirs. Instead, I drafted a single-line email from an encrypted account and sent it to the Institutional Research Ethics Board. Please verify normalization coefficient in dataset 4B. No accusation, no explanation, just a coordinate, within 48 hours. Tension shifted inside the department. Whitmore began asking questions about data security. IT conducted superficial access checks. Elise avoided eye contact in hallways. Someone had clearly unsettled the narrative. 3 days later, my phone rang. "You wouldn't sabotage this, would you?" Whitmore asked. Voice controlled but tight beneath the surface. I let a pause stretch just long enough. I didn't sabotage anything. Because I didn't alter the data. I didn't fabricate numbers. I simply declined to rescue them from their own haste. They had chosen optics over verification. I chose silence. That distinction mattered. By the end of the week, the Ethics Board formally responded, due to methodological clarification concerns. They requested an independent statistical audit. Timeline 10 days, 10 days. Whitmore sent a department-wide message framing it as routine transparency. Elise reposted it with a smiling emoji. I closed my laptop and reviewed my offline archive once more. Every timestamp aligned. Every version history preserved. They had celebrated a number. Now they would have to defend it. The audit began under fluorescent lights and controlled smiles. Whitmore called an emergency meeting before the external reviewers arrived. Framing the situation as an internal breach, he stood at the head of the conference table. Hands clasped, speaking about loyalty and data integrity as if both had been violated by someone other than himself. Elise sat beside him, perfectly dressed, perfectly rehearsed until the first independent analyst asked for the original raw files and version history. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "I'll have to check with IT," she said, voice thinner than usual. The analyst didn't blink. "We'll need direct repository access." That was when I received the email summoning me as a technical advisor. The title almost made me smile, for weeks. I had been erased. Now I was required. When I entered the room, conversation dipped by half a tone. For the first time since the press conference, I looked directly at Whitmore without lowering my eyes. He held my gaze for a second too long, as if recalculating something he thought he had already solved. The lead statistician turned to me. "Dr. Blake, did you design the statistical backbone of this model?" Whitmore cut in smoothly. "We collaborated extensively." I didn't argue. I opened my laptop. With deliberate calm, I projected the repository history onto the main screen. 8 years of commits, timestamped, archived, 97% of structural modifications attributed to my credentials. Every normalization update, every variable refinement, every regression adjustment. Silence thickened. Elise's complexion shifted from confident to drained in under 10 seconds. She leaned toward her father and whispered something I couldn't hear. Whitmore straightened in his chair. The analyst scrolled further. "We're observing an inconsistency in the enzyme normalization coefficients between archived drafts and the published submission." The room tightened. Whitmore attempted composure, minor iteration variance. The analyst zoomed in. The variance changes projected recovery outcomes by over 20%. No one spoke after that. I folded my hands on the table and kept my expression neutral. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I simply allowed the math to speak. 10 minutes later, the audit committee formally flagged the enzyme model for methodological review. What Whitmore had dismissed as routine transparency was now classified as a structural inconsistency requiring escalation. Across the table, Elise avoided my eyes entirely. For the first time, the applause had nowhere to hide. "If you believe I was right to let the audit expose the truth instead of rescuing their mistake, leave a 1 in the comments because your voice matters. And every perspective adds weight to how we define fairness and accountability." Public doubt moved faster than any formal report. Within 24 hours of the audit flag, A respected scientific blog published a headline that traveled through academic circles like a shockwave. Whitmore Lab data integrity questioned. The phrasing was cautious, almost polite, but the implication was unmistakable. By the end of the second day, the private biotech fund backing the research had dropped 12% in valuation. Investors were not sentimental, they were mathematical. Whitmore responded the only way he knew how with a press conference, standing before cameras again. He adjusted his tie and delivered a calm explanation. "We are undergoing a minor technical recalibration," he said. "Such refinements are common in groundbreaking research." Minor. The flagged variants altered projected efficacy by 21% in pharmaceutical development. That was not a rounding error. That was the difference between promising and unsustainable. Elise followed with a brief statement to faculty, suggesting the discrepancy may have originated from junior staff processing layers of the dataset. The phrase circulated quickly. Junior staff. It was a convenient abstraction, one that implied distance from responsibility. Taryn Blake did not respond publicly. Instead, she finalized a comprehensive statistical memorandum and submitted it directly to the audit board. Every claim was supported with time-stamped repository logs predating the press announcement. The normalization coefficient shift was documented line by line. She did not accuse. She did not editorialize. She simply aligned versions, dates, and projected outcomes in one clear progression. When reporters began calling the department for comment, Whitmore's tone hardened. "This is an internal technical review." He insisted, "There is no evidence of misconduct." Yet the language outside the building was changing. Analysts began using words like inconsistency, inflation, and oversight. The narrative no longer centered on celebration, but on verification. Then, late Friday afternoon, another message arrived, this one from Stockholm. The Nobel Committee formally notified the university that consideration of the nomination would be paused pending the outcome of the independent audit. Paused, not denied, not revoked. Paused was worse. It suggested uncertainty in the span of a week. Authority had shifted. Whitmore was still speaking, still defending, still framing. But now every sentence he delivered required proof. And proof, inconveniently, lived in the data. The collapse did not arrive with shouting. It arrived in a formal memo. The independent audit concluded that the data had been selectively interpreted. No one used the word fraud. The language remained careful, almost restrained. But buried 2 paragraphs below was the phrase that mattered: negligence at the leadership level. In academia, that was the equivalent of a cracked foundation. Whitmore called another internal meeting within hours of the report's release. His voice carried less authority now, sharpened by urgency. The statistical modeling was primarily handled by Dr. Blake. He said, "She managed the math." The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Taryn sat at the far end of the table, listening as her name was repositioned from architect to liability. For weeks, she had said nothing publicly. She had allowed documentation and procedure to unfold, but blame, once redirected, required correction. She opened her laptop. "I'd like the committee to review a directive dated 6 weeks before the press conference," she said evenly. The email appeared on the shared screen. It was sent from Whitmore's university account to her and 2 communications staff members. The subject line referenced presentation strategy. In the body, he had written, "We need to optimize presentation impact before external review." Below that, attached as a scanned note in his own handwriting, was a single instruction: don't overcomplicate with margin error. No one in the room spoke. The phrase lingered like a fingerprint. One committee member leaned forward. "To clarify, you were advised to minimize statistical discussion regarding variance." Taryn did not embellish. "I was advised to simplify." Whitmore's composure fractured for the first time. That's being taken out of context. But context was no longer his to define. By the end of the meeting, the provost's office announced an expanded internal review. The scope now included potential conflicts of interest related to authorship decisions and familial oversight structures within the department. The language was bureaucratic. The implication was not. What had begun as a technical discrepancy was now an institutional question, and institutions, unlike individuals, documented everything. The counterattack came wrapped in sympathy and studio lighting, 3 nights after the university announced its internal review. Elise appeared on national television. She wore pale blue, minimal makeup, and the expression of someone rehearsed to appear wounded. "This is academic jealousy," she said, voice breaking at exactly the right syllables. "My father and I are being targeted for our success." The clip circulated within hours. Colleagues forwarded it with neutral subject lines. Donors called the department requesting reassurance. By the end of the week, Whitmore had retained a litigation firm specializing in reputational defense. Then the formal notice arrived at my apartment, a defamation complaint alleging that my communications with the audit board had caused irreparable professional harm. I read it twice. Then I began compiling my response. 47 internal emails documenting authorship discussions, 11 recorded departmental meetings, all stored in compliance with university transparency policy. Repository metadata proving the authorship changes occurred after my access was restricted. Every file timestamped, every version history intact. I did not editorialize. I did not dramatize. I attached. Their attorneys requested mediation within 10 days. "We believe this can be resolved discreetly," the senior partner said during our preliminary call. His tone implied generosity. I declined. "There's nothing to resolve." I answered. "The documentation speaks for itself." Pressure escalated quickly. Anonymous messages suggested I was damaging the institution. A faculty colleague warned me quietly. "They're trying to isolate you." I responded by forwarding every communication to my counsel and to the university compliance office. If they wanted scrutiny, they would have it in daylight. Then something shifted. A former doctoral candidate contacted my attorney. He had left the program 2 years earlier under personal circumstances. In a signed affidavit, he described being instructed by Whitmore to adjust interpretive framing in a prior study to strengthen grant renewal prospects. The language felt familiar. This time, I wasn't the only voice in the room, and the narrative of jealousy began to fracture under its own weight. The reckoning arrived in a document no one could spin. At 9 in the morning, the university released the final report. I read it alone at my kitchen table, coffee untouched, heart steady in a way it hadn't been for months. The key line was not buried this time. It stood alone in bold, significant authorship misrepresentation. There it was. Not jealousy, not miscommunication, misrepresentation. By noon, Dean Daniel Whitmore was formally suspended pending termination proceedings. The provost cited breach of ethical oversight and conflict of interest violations. Elise's research license was revoked for 5 years. Effective immediately. Her name would not appear on funded clinical trials during that period. The $80 million biotech grant tied to the regenerative project was withdrawn within 48 hours. Investors do not wait for appeals. Phones rang across campus. Faculty who had avoided eye contact now sent careful messages. "If you need support, let me know. Support." I didn't respond. Instead, I watched the story evolve beyond the university walls. A major scientific journal requested a feature interview not about scandal, but about methodological integrity. For the first time, my name appeared in print as lead architect of the neural regeneration model. No qualifiers, no shared spotlight, just attribution aligned with authorship records that had always existed. When the article went live, I reread one sentence twice, Dr. Taryn Blake preserved original data logs that ultimately clarified the integrity dispute. Preserved, clarified, words that felt clean. Whitmore issued a brief statement through counsel calling the findings procedurally flawed. Elise remained silent. Litigation threats evaporated. That evening, after the campus quieted and media requests slowed, a new email appeared in my inbox. The sender address ended in Sweden. It was not a press inquiry. It was a private communication from the Nobel Committee acknowledging receipt of corrected data and inviting a confidential submission review under my name. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. Justice hadn't arrived with fireworks. It arrived with documentation and a quiet recalibration of whose name belonged beside the work. The final hearing felt less like drama and more like arithmetic. I walked into the university tribunal room carrying nothing but a thin folder of printed correspondence. No media, no audience, just the Oversight Council seated behind a long oak table. Whitmore and his attorney to my left, and Elise one chair behind him. The air was professionally neutral, the kind of neutrality institutions adopt when they intend to survive a scandal. Whitmore looked older than he had a month earlier, not defeated, just stripped of ceremony. When his turn came to speak, he abandoned legal phrasing. "You ruined my family," he said. Not loudly, but directly at me. There it was. Not misconduct, not data, family. I met his eyes without anger. No. I replied evenly. I corrected the equation. Silence followed, not theatrical, but measured. The council chair requested final clarifications regarding authorship decisions, supervisory boundaries, and documented directives. My responses were brief: dates, times, repository logs. The mathematics did not require embellishment. Whitmore's attorney attempted one last argument about collaborative ambiguity. The chair interrupted gently. The documentation is not ambiguous. After a short recess, the council returned to deliver its decision. The vote was 9-1. Effective immediately. Daniel Whitmore's privileges to supervise graduate research were permanently revoked. His tenure review would proceed under disciplinary review. The language was clinical. The outcome was not. Elise did not speak. She gathered her folder slowly, stood, and left the room without looking at me. The door closed with a quiet finality that felt more definitive than the vote itself. As the council adjourned, the chair paused before I exited. "Dr. Blake," she said, "your preservation of original data was instrumental. The university intends to formalize new independent research oversight structures. We would like you to lead one." I nodded once. Outside, the campus looked unchanged, students crossing lawns, faculty discussing lectures, life proceeding with institutional indifference. But something fundamental had shifted. Authority no longer sat with inheritance. It sat with record, with verification, with restraint. Whitmore had accused me of destruction. What I had actually done was remove distortion, and when distortion disappears, what remains is simply the result. Correction, in the end, was almost quiet. Back in my lab this time, with full access restored, I opened the archived model and adjusted the normalization coefficient by 0.7%. The change was small, almost anticlimactic. The projected neural recovery rate recalculated to 61%. No miracle curve, no dramatic spike. Just a stable, reproducible outcome that other labs could verify without distortion. We republished the findings under my authorship. The paper was described as methodologically rigorous and ethically transparent. 61% was not glamorous. It did not promise headlines. But it held. Not every discovery needs applause. It needs truth. Whitmore gradually disappeared from academic conferences and editorial boards. His name surfaced only in procedural footnotes. Elise transitioned into commercial consulting, advising startups on presentation strategy rather than leading clinical trials. The university moved forward, instituting oversight policies I helped design. As for me, I continued the work 3 years later. I received a major international award for contributions to regenerative modeling, not for spectacle, not for revenge, but for consistency. The citation referenced data preservation and ethical authorship standards as much as scientific advancement. During a press interview, a reporter asked whether I regretted allowing the situation to escalate instead of confronting it earlier. I answered without hesitation. Science doesn't forgive ego, it corrects it. That was never about punishment. It was about alignment. And in the end, all I did was remove the error. Power rarely collapses because someone shouts. It collapses because someone documents. That's what this experience taught me. Not every injustice demands a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes the most effective response is precision, patience, and a refusal to distort the truth even when distortion would benefit you. I learned that protecting your work is not ego, it is responsibility. And staying silent is not weakness if you are gathering proof. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the waiting, the restraint, the discipline of letting evidence speak before anger did. But there is something deeply human about choosing integrity over impulse, not because it guarantees victory, but because it preserves who you are. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have corrected the number immediately, confronted publicly, walked away? I'm genuinely curious. And before we continue building stories like this, tell me, where are you listening from today if this story resonated with you? Your support matters more than you think. A single subscription helps this channel reach someone who may be questioning their own silence. A comment can spark a conversation that shifts perspective. A share might remind someone that documentation is power. When you engage, you're not just supporting content, you're helping integrity travel further. And that might be the most important correction of all. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.